In the name of Allah, the Magnificent, the Compassionate, the All-Powerful, I present to you a selection of stories from 1001 Nights. The day that King Shahryar's father died was both the saddest and most important moment of his life. He would miss the old man terribly, of course, but he was determined to make his father proud of him and be even as great a king as his father had been. And his very first act was to divide his entire kingdom in half and give half of it to his younger brother to rule in the south. Both brothers in their time married, and both brothers became great kings of a like never seen before. But when some 15 years had passed, King Shahryar found that he missed his younger brother greatly, and he sent the fastest messengers at his disposal to go and tell his younger brother to please come and visit, for the love of God. His younger brother was delighted at the news, for he too missed King Shahryar greatly, and he prepared a great caravan of camels laden with fine carpets and silks and incense and piles of gold as presents for his older brother. He took leave of his wife, saying he'd be gone for several months, and his wife couldn't hold back the tears at their parting. He left the palace with his great camel caravan. They set out into the desert, but it hadn't gone more than half an hour when he realized he'd forgotten the most important present of all, a string of precious gems that he wanted to present to his older brother as a present from his heart. And hurrying back to the palace, he slipped in from a side staircase, climbed up the royal stairs, into the bedroom, and found his wife in bed with the cook. If this is what she does after half an hour, what would she do in several months? And so saying to himself, he withdrew his sword and cut both of them to pieces. And without telling anyone what he had done, he slipped once again out of the palace and rejoined the caravan. Now, the journey across the desert was long and hard. Searing hot days, freezing cold nights, and King Shahryar's younger brother's journey was made all the worse for the image of his wife's betrayal. And it ate away at his heart, it poisoned his soul. So by the time he arrived at King Shahryar's palace, he wasn't half the man he used to be. King Shahryar rode out to greet him, but was dismayed to find his younger brother looking so ill. But he assumed it was just the stress of the journey. But when several days had passed, and still his younger brother wasn't well, King Shahryar pressed him what could possibly be wrong. He sent for his finest doctors and physicians to come and treat him. But even with their best medicines and use of leeches, nothing seemed to help. Finally, King Shahryar proposed a hunting party. They would go out into the desert with their camels and their hawks, and perhaps that would cheer up his younger brother. No, please, I wish only to rest. King Shahryar, okay. They blew the horns. He rode out the camels, leaving his younger brother behind. His younger brother waited up there on the top floor of the palace. But before half an hour had gone by, he saw something very strange. King Shahryar's wife came walking out into the main courtyard, followed by 20 beautiful dancing girls, each one of them as beautiful as the moon at its fullest. 20 white slaves jumped out, and each one of them paired off with a dancing girl, and they fell to the floor to consume their passion. The queen walked towards the center of the courtyard. "Come to me, my lord." And from a tree in the center of the courtyard jumped down an enormous African slave, twice the size of any normal man. He walked up to the queen, and as a button might take the loop, he took her in his arms, and they fell to the ground until their appetites were satisfied. My God. If this is what can happen to my brother, who is, after all, a far greater king than I am, what do I have to worry about? And so that night, for the first time in many weeks, King Shahryar's younger brother ate well and slept a good night's sleep. So when King Shahryar came back from his hunting expedition a few days later, he was delighted to find his younger brother in the best of health. But what was it that was troubling you? I'd really rather not say. But how is it you are returned to health? That also I would rather not say. But when he pressed him, King Shahryar's younger brother told him the story of having set out into the desert, returned to his palace to find his wife in bed with the cook, and how he had killed both of them. I would have done the very same thing. In fact, I would have killed 1,000. But that way madness lies. But I must know, what is the cause of your cure, your return to health? If you must know, I cannot tell you. You must see with your own eyes. Tomorrow, pretend to go hunting again, but return secretly to the palace and join me up here in my room, and you will know all too soon. Well, King Shahryar couldn't understand this bit of advice, but it's okay. So the next day he blew the horns and the hunting party went out again with the fast camels and the hawks. But after half an hour, King Shahryar crept back to the palace, entered in the side door, climbed up the staircase, and joined his younger brother on the top floor. Before half an hour had passed, King Shahryar's wife once again walked out into the courtyard, followed by the 20 delicious servant girls. Out came the 20 white slaves. They paired up once again and fell to the ground in passion. And once again, King Shahryar's wife called out, "Come to me, my lord." And the enormous African slave jumped down once again and took her in his arms. Verily, there is no security or safe place in this world but in the love of God. If this can happen to a king, why be king? There is no trusting womankind. Let us leave this place and walk the earth like ordinary men, and none shall know our name or station. Until maybe one day we find someone who has suffered more than us. So it was the two kings left the palace, dressed as ordinary travellers with a stick and a cloak, and they walked the lands of Arabia. They crossed deserts and mountains until finally they came to the edge of the ocean itself and didn't know where next to go. Their decision was made for them, however, as the ground began to shake and the sea began to be stirred up in enormous waves. And fearing for their lives, the two kings climbed up a palm tree and hid up there in the branches, and not a moment too soon. For emerged from the ocean an enormous, stinking black jinn. A jinn, you might know more popularly by the name of genie, is a name for any spirit in the lands of Arabia. And most of the time, they are malevolent and evil. And this one was no exception. He emerged from the ocean, the size of 5 men, carrying a crystal coffin on his head. He set it down upon the sands, opened up the lid, and out stepped a beautiful young woman, as fair as the moon at its brightest. Then the jinn fell noisily asleep, with his head in the young woman's lap, snoring mightily, sounding like a great lion. Presently, the young lady looked up and saw the two kings where they trembled in the branches of the tree. "Come down." They declined politely. Come down, or I shall wake my husband, this awful jinn, and he shall do the worst of deaths." The two kings hurried down. The young woman removed the jinn's head from her lap with some effort. She stood up, approached the two kings, and with one graceful movement pulled off her dress, leaving her as naked as the day she was born. "Now make love to me." The kings made their excuses and would have declined politely, but then she moved to awaken her husband once again, and they saw they had no choice. When both kings had done their duty, she replaced her dress and asked for both of their rings, and removing a bag from a pocket hidden inside her dress, she joined the rings with some 500 other. This despicable jinn stole me from my room on my wedding night. He locks me in that box to make sure I can get at no other man, so I take every chance I can to cheat him. Now go." The two kings didn't need to be told twice, and they ran as fast as their legs could carry them. In fact, they ran until they had no breath left in their lungs, and they hid behind a rock, overcome with everything they had seen and done in the last half an hour.
If this could happen to a mighty jinn with supernatural powers 5 times the size of us, then what cause have we for complaint? Let us return to our kingdom and take once again our title. But never trust again in womankind, for verily they are all the same.
The two kings returned to King Shahryar's palace, whereupon King Shahriyar made it known that he would wed a new woman every day, and the following morning cut off her head. He began with his own wife, the queen, and her head went rolling through the courtyard. And so began a pattern that for the next 2 years, King Shahryar married over 700 beautiful young women, had his way with them on the wedding night, and the very next morning, their heads went rolling. In fact, this left his kingdom in a state of disaster and disrepair. All the families that could, who had the money to, moved away, but it was a long journey across the desert, and not all could afford to. And some took to hiding their daughters in the basement of their houses. Now it happened that King Shahryar's wazir, his chief advisor, had 2 beautiful young daughters, Sherazad and Dunyazad. Sherazad was but 17 years old at the time, fair-spoken, beautiful, a master of the languages and the arts, and she begged her father to let her be King Shahryar's next wife. He protested. Had she not seen what happened to all the other hundreds of young girls like her? But at the same time, he knew there was no contesting her will. Whatever she wanted, she got. So weeping bitterly, the wazir consented for Sherazade to marry the king the very next day. That night, in their bedchamber, after they had made love, King Shahryar would have, as usual, fallen straight asleep, when there came a knock at the door. Opening it, it was Shahrazade's younger sister, Dunyazad. She came in and begged the king that, as her sister only had a few hours left of life, might they not hear a story to make the night pass a little longer?
Well, I do love stories.
And so Sherazade began with the first of 1,001 nights. And she told the story of Abu Hassan. Abu Hassan was one of the richest, most eligible bachelors in all of Baghdad. He had a large house, many slaves, fine carpets, good sense of humour, he was well connected, but he had never married.
Far be it from me to take to my chest a bag full of snakes,
He would say.
Marriage?
is joy for a month and misery for a life. But whether it was the pressure of growing old without a son to take over his name and his house when he would die, or perhaps just he grew lonely after all these years, when Abu Hassan heard that the daughter of the governor was looking for a husband, he at last was persuaded and agreed to be married. And all of his friends and family celebrated. And a fine wedding was planned. They called the best musicians in the land. A fine palace was hired for the occasion. There were wonderful foods served. There were chickens that had been fed their entire lives on nothing but pistachio nuts. There were whole roast goats, their mouths stuffed with dates, and all manner of walnut and pistachio pastries and fine sherbets. Abu Hassan, in the evening, walked forward on the balcony and threw gold coins to the poor, who all called his name in thanks and celebration. Then the bride was brought out, in the first of 7 dresses, a glittering turquoise gown, littered with gems on her sleeves and neck. And each dress that she came out in was more lovely than the one that went before, until she came out in the 7th dress, a shining, simple white frock with a string of pearls that matched her teeth, and all agreed they had rarely seen a more lovely woman in the world. She retired shyly to the bedchamber to wait for her husband. But Abu Hassan could not bear yet to leave his guests and his friends so, and he saw it as his duty as host to entertain them with a store of stories and jokes, tempered with wise reflections on philosophy and politics. Until, as everyone lit their pipes full of the finest tobacco, lying back upon the silk cushions, Abu Hassan felt the juices of desire begin to stir within him. And rising, he would have said good night to his guests, to go and join his new wife in the bedchamber. But alas, as Abu Hassan stood up, he found that he had eaten and drunk far too much. And losing entire control of his body, he couldn't help but release a terrible, loud, thundering fart. And perceiving the approach of dawn, Shahrazad fell quiet. Now King Shahryar had taken an oath to execute every wife that he had the day after their wedding night. But what of Abu Hassan?
I just have to know. Okay, one more night.
And so the following night, Shahrazad continued with her story. After the interruption to the party, everybody fell deathly quiet, and then resumed their conversation as though they had heard nothing at all. Abu Hassan walked to the side corridor, gravely, in the direction of the bedchamber, but then opened a side door to the palace, slipped out, jumped on the fastest camel he could find, and rode all night to Basra, where he there jumped on a ship bound for India, not knowing if he would ever return to his homeland. He stood there on the bow of the ship, watching Arabia disappear into the horizon, tears streaming down his cheek and soaking his beard. When arriving in Bombay, in India, thanks to his gifts for languages and his natural ability at dealing with men, Abu Hassan found himself employment with a local Raja, a local king. And before a couple of years had passed, he rose to be captain of the Raja's bodyguard. But although his service was exemplary, and all who knew him loved him and admired him, never in the 10 years he served with the Raja was he ever seen to smile. In fact, sometimes they would see him on the balcony of his room, looking westward, sighing deeply and All imagined he must be some great man living under a cloud. But when 10 years had passed, Abu Hassan couldn't bear it any longer. He had to return to his homeland. He missed it so. Taking leave of the Raja, who was sorry to leave such a wonderful captain, Abu Hassan took all that he owned and boarded a ship back for Arabia. Landing in Basra, he jumped in a coach and they rode towards Baghdad. But the closer they grew, the memory of that night 10 years ago grew in his mind. And he became more and more nervous. Until on the edge of the city, he could bear it no longer. And he jumped out before they arrived in the streets. And Abu Hassan spent several days walking around the hills of the city, biting his nails and living on roots and wild berries that he could find. How could he know if anybody remembered? Well, fortune smiled on him after 3 days when he saw a distant peasant's hut with a candlelight gleaming through the cracks. He crept closer and heard an old Bedouin woman as she put her daughter to sleep. "Oh, Mama, when was I born?" "Well, that's easy, my dear. You were born on the night that Abu Hassan farted." Hearing these terrible words, Abu Hassan's hair turned white at once. He departed Arabia and was never seen again. Now, in truth, Shehrazad told many stories to the king, each night interrupting her story just at the vital point, when he couldn't bear to not know how it finished. However, when a year had passed, the king reflected that his good name was at stake. After all, he had made a solemn promise.
Shehrazad, a vow is a vow. And tomorrow you must die.
"But of course, O king, your wish is my command." "It is strange, though."
What is strange?"
"Well, the other day my father was giving a party for some tradesmen of the city. There was a merchant there, even a baker and a barber. And then a young man from the south, from Basra, came in. He saw the barber and he trembled with rage. He turned around and walked out of our house. We followed him, of course, asking him what he meant by this insult to our hospitality. And we saw that as he walked away, he limped, and his leg had perhaps been broken in some place. We begged him to tell us what was wrong. But finally, he told us it concerned the barber, and that he would not stay 1 minute more in the room with that foul fellow, as he called him. And so she began the story of the young man and the barber of Basra. This particular young man was that exception in the Arabic world, an only child. Born to a rich businessman, his mother had died in birth. Yet he lived many happy years with his father until he too died tragically young, leaving the man an orphan at the age of 16. Grief overtook him. He was now as rich as any young man could hope to be, but that couldn't compensate for his loss. And every day he just walked through the streets without knowing where he was going, without caring. Until one afternoon, fortune took him down a side street that ended in a dead end. And he was about to turn around and go back when, on the 3rd floor, on the balcony of a fine house in the courtyard, stood a young woman as beautiful as the moon shining at its fullest. And he lost his heart at once and forgot his grief. But a moment later, a carriage pulled up in the main plaza, and preceded by two formidable-looking bodyguards, out stepped the governor of the city. He gave the young man a dirty look before walking into that very same house. And all at once, the young man realized his new love must be the daughter of the governor. And at once he despaired and began to pull out his hair in grief, for she was far out of his reach, the son of a simple businessman. He returned home to his house, and for days he refused to eat or drink, allowing only his servants to change the sheets when they became completely soaked with his tears. They called for doctors, but none knew what was the cause of his malaise. Only an old woman in the house, a seamstress, who made her money by going from house to house and repairing holes in old clothes. She took one look at the man and guessed immediately what was wrong. "What is her name, my lord?" "I do not know, but she is the daughter of the governor, and my life is over." "Do not worry, for I have cause to visit her house in the course of my work. I shall win her heart for you." So it was, late in the afternoon, the young lady in question came in from the balcony, where she liked to take a breath of fresh air once in a while, and found the old lady sitting in a chair in the corner of the room, thick salty tears streaming down her face. "Oh, auntie, what can be the matter?" "There is a young man, not a mile from here, dying, all because of you." "Because of me? But how so?" "He saw you a couple of days ago and fell in love. And now I fear he will not last the night." "Oh, why then, go to him and tell him that I am twice as lovesick as he is. And tell him to come and visit me on the Friday when my father will be out at praying at the mosque. Come before the second prayer at midday." The old woman hurried back home, found the young man and told him the news. He was overjoyed and rose from his bed in the first time in days and pressed gold coins into her greedy palms. The minutes passed like days until Friday arrived. But that morning, the old lady found the young man preparing to go out, dressed in his finest suit, perfuming himself. "But have you been to the hammam to wash and get ready?" "Well, of course I have. What do you take me for?" "What? I forgot to shave." Quick, you hurry to the market and bring me back a barber to shave me. But mind he's not an overly talkative fellow. I can't stand gossips." The old lady hurried off to the market and brought back a barber with a shining bald head and a bristling moustache, gleaming eyes. "Sir, I had the honor to shave your father's chin before you, and now it is my honor to shave yours." Yes, if you wouldn't mind hurrying, I do have an appointment." "Are you going to meet a young lady? Perhaps I may be of some assistance, for I am most experienced in high romance, and I know the ways of women." No, just going to meet some friends, actually, but if you wouldn't mind hurrying up." "Of course, sir." The young man sat back in the chair, but the barber pulled out of his bag a large silk tablecloth that he then began to smooth meticulously. And he removed from his bag a seemingly endless procession of little bottles and jars of ointments and gels, scents and perfumes, studying each one carefully. He then picked up the soap brush and was about to soap the young man's chin when an idea seemed to occur to him. And returning to his bag, he took out a piece of paper and a pencil. "What on earth are you doing?" the young man cried, thinking of the precious minutes slipping by when he should be with his love. "Sir, by my calculations, We are in the 200th day of the year 1054, since our prophet, peace be upon you, fled from Mecca to Medina. By my calculations, Uranus is in conjunction with Mercury, making this a most auspicious day to shave your chin. But I see Saturn is also in the 7th house, which will mean disaster for any encounter of a romantic nature. When was a barber ever an astrologer? Not only am I an astrologer, I am also master of logic, rhetoric, the sciences and the arts, arithmetic and geometry. And he began to finally soap the young man's chin. But do not take me for some idle gossip, for I am known as the modest man, the silent man. The young man could barely contain his frustration, but didn't dare say anything in case it caused the barber to talk even more. He had just begun to shave the first side of the young man's chin. Oh, what now? I have just remembered. I have invited 5 friends to dine at my house this very lunchtime, but I have forgotten to buy anything for them to eat. Then you may go to my kitchen and find whatever you need, but will you please hurry? And what is there in your kitchen? At least 4 fried chickens and as many pastries as you can find. Oh, sir, you are as kind as your father. And for dessert? There are sherbets and dates and dried nuts. Will you please hurry? Oh, sir, but I am never eating without a fine glass of wine to wash it down. My cellar is full. You can choose. Sir, you are as kind as your father before you. But what about the perfumes? I have a room full of them. Show them to me. The young man jumped up and ran into the room and brought back armfuls of bottles, which he laid down upon the table. Now, in the name of God, will you begin? But the barber insisted on taking each bottle and sampling each one first. Oh. When he finished, he finally shaved the young man's chin, who then grabbed the towel from him to dry his face and jumped up. But sir, I am now in your debt for your kindness today, and I suspect from your hurry, you are going to meet a young woman, and I must offer my services. No, really, I'm just going to meet some friends. You are trying to trick me. No, in fact, why don't you take all this food and wine home and then come and join me? The barber agreed, but suspecting a trick, he took out the food and wine and paid a young boy to carry them back home for him, while the barber hid himself in a doorway, just as he had suspected. A moment later, the young man emerged from the house and ran down the street as fast as his legs could carry him, and the barber followed at a discreet distance. They ran down through the city, through a maze of side streets, arriving finally at the plaza, where the young man approached the front door. The maid let him in, and he ran up to the 3rd floor, where his love was waiting for him impatiently. But why are you so late? Oh no, and here comes my father. He's returned from prayer early. Quick, hide in the box, and soon he'll go out to lunch once more. So saying, the young man hid himself in an enormous wooden box in the corner of the room. Now it happened at that moment. A maid in the kitchen was carrying a tray of expensive glasses. She tripped, and the tray fell to the floor, all the glasses and crystals smashing into many pieces. The cook began to shout and yell and beat her around the head while she screamed inside. Out there in the plaza, the barber, hearing the noise inside, assumed the worst. "Murder! Murder!" he called, beginning to tear out his hair and his clothes. "They are murdering my master!" A crowd began to form around him, and they too began to pull their clothes and their hair apart, beating at the door. until finally it was opened by the governor.
Yes?
"You're murdering my master!" "And what would your master be doing in my house?" "He has come for a secret romantic meeting with your daughter." And perceiving the approach of dawn, Shehrazad once again grew quiet. Well, King Shahryar, he couldn't sleep the rest of the night, terribly afraid for this young man. He said,
I have to know. I have to know.
and so he gave Shehrazad just one more day of life. That evening, she concluded the tale. The governor's face at these words grew pale. He turned and ran up the staircase and burst in to his daughter's room, followed closely by the barber. The barber, being a very astute fellow, he followed the young girl's eyes and saw her glance at the box, guessing where his master was hidden. The barber, who was a strong man also, he pushed the governor aside, ran forwards, picked up the box on his shoulders, and ran down the steps of the house, followed closely by the governor, who grabbed a sword from the wall. They ran out into the main square. Now, all the meantime, the poor young man was inside the box, with no idea what was happening to him. But he knew it was nothing good. He decided to take his chances out in the open. Pushing open the lid of the box, he fell to the ground and broke his leg in several places. "Ah!" the governor yelled, running upon him with his sword raised high above. And that would have been the end of things, had the young man not had the presence of mind to put his hand in his pockets and pull out a series of gold coins, which he threw up in the air. The crowd began to scramble for the money, and in the confusion and the chaos, the young man managed to crawl his way to safety. He then left Basra, never wanting to return, and he had just arrived in Baghdad and been invited to join a very pleasant little party, when the very first person he should see would be the barber, that cursed barber. And he vowed he would never stay 1 minute in the same room with him. And that was why he had walked off.
You could never trust a barber. If I had my way, I would chop the head off of every barber I see in my sight from now on.
You'll see by now that King Shahryar's solution to any problem that came up was simply to cut off the head of the offending person. And so it was, on the 500th night, Shehrazad told her husband one day, "O king, everyone admires you and respects you and fears you, but would you not rather be loved?"
Show me the king that was ever loved.
Well, there was one.
Oh?
And so Shehrazad began the tale of the Sultan and Ali. Long ago, she said, in the Middle East, there was a Sultan who ruled a vast kingdom, and he was loved deeply by everyone who lived there. He was known for his wise and compassionate rule. But of course, nobody rules alone. Everybody, whether they be a humble duke or a mighty emperor, everybody has advisors to help them in the decisions they make from day to day. In the case of the Sultan, he relied upon his wazir, a tall, bony man named Ahmed, to help him in the decisions he made from day to day. Ahmed was a tall, wiry man who walked incessantly from side to side in his room, thinking about his role in the Sultan's kingdom. Ahmed, do this. Ahmed, do that. Ahmed, should we raise the taxes? Ahmed, should we build new roads? Ahmed, should I have boiled eggs or fried? The old fool can't do a thing without me. I do all the work. He gets all the credit. In short, Ahmed had long grown tired of playing number two, and he eyed the Sultan's throne like a cat who has seen a bowl of cream. But while the Sultan was still so popular with the army and all of his people, there was nothing really he could do. It was only one evening when he was walking from side to side on the balcony, throwing bits of raw meat for the crows to fight over, his favourite way of relaxing, that the idea came to him. And he hurried off to the underground libraries deep beneath the palace. For the next month, Ahmed buried himself in ancient volumes and manuscripts, some which were lost in time, in languages that were all but indecipherable, solving ancient puzzles buried in time. Until at last, after a month of studying, the tall candles sending strange, sinister shadows on the wall of his bony frame, Ahmed found what he was looking for. The next day, he presented himself in front of the Sultan. My Sultan, may your wisdom never grow any the less. I should like to take a tour of the kingdom, to remind those who are living furthest from you that they are closest to your heart.
It's a wonderful idea. Ahmed, what would I do without you, huh?
Yes. Taking the fastest camel, Ahmed then rode to all the four corners of the kingdom. The snowy mountains to the north, the impassable deserts and quicksands of the south, the wide plains of the west. But he went to places where it was thought that nobody lived. But it wasn't the people that Ahmed had come to find, but rather the birds. Taking with him a small group of scouts and hunters, Ahmed went looking for 1,001 species of bird, from the giant eagles of the mountains to the north, to the flightless ostrich that ran along desert plains, to the swifts that spent their entire life in flight until an arrow took them down. And if, in the course of his work, one of his helpers might fall from a mountain peak to his death, or drown in quicksand, you can't make an omelette without breaking a few eggs, Ahmed would conclude. At last, he found what he was looking for. He then set out to track down an obscure gypsy caravan, who some believed were only rumoured to exist. After several weeks of hunting, he saw some smoke in the distance and knew he was on the right track. And riding in, he found a collection of ragged tents. And from the first of them, out stepped an old gypsy woman, dressed in scarves and petticoats, her eyes completely eaten away by cataracts. "Welcome, Ahmed. If you know who I am, you must know why I have come. The book of destiny is open for all to read." "Well then, take this," Ahmed said, throwing down 2 bags, one full of gold coins, and the other with 1,001 feathers. "When will it be ready?" "By the morning." "And I shall ride forth to my glory." "To your destiny." Now the Sultan, back in his palace, was rather surprised that his favourite advisor had been gone for so long, and in fact it was the Sultan's birthday coming up, when normally his chief advisor would be the one who would oversee all the preparations. But how hard could it be? So he organised himself a carriage to take him through the streets of the city, where it was the custom for the Sultan on his birthday to throw gold coins to the poor, who would cheer his name as he passed by. And so on this day he set out, and enormous crowds gathered to celebrate their dear beloved Sultan. But when the procession came to the central square, a shadow fell over the Sultan. Looking up, the crowd fell silent as they saw there, hovering 10 meters above the Sultan, sat Ahmed on a flying carpet made from the feathers of 1,001 birds. And perceiving the approach of dawn, Shehrazad grew quiet. Of course, she was allowed to live one more day. And that night, she continued with the story. The crowd found no words to say and held their breath at this display of sorcery and witchcraft. Ahmed, what is the meaning of this? The Sultan cried. The meaning, you old fool, is that your time is up. With this flying carpet, I am now invincible. Look, this very morning I have flown into the palaces of the nearby kingdoms and stolen their flags. If they do not send us great riches at once, I shall simply fly in and cut their throats. It's time for a new kind of Sultan. Sultan Ahmed. Everyone held their head in their hands. They couldn't believe they were about to lose their dear, dear ruler in place for some scheming wazir. Only the Sultan didn't seem to be too upset. Ahmed, he said, reaching into his jacket and pulling out a long bone pipe. What is that? Well, it's a funny thing. You see, while you were away, this old gypsy woman came walking into the palace. She insisted she had to see me. She gave me this. Apparently it's made from the bones of 1,001 birds. Seemed to think it might come in useful. And setting the pipe to his lips, the Sultan blew. But no sound was heard to come out. Ahmed looked around him, but the sky seemed clear, and he just began to relax when he heard a caw. And then he saw a distant black spot against the sun that grew larger and larger as it drew closer, until the air was filled with the feathers and claws and beaks of 1,001 birds returned for revenge. They fell down upon the wazir, biting and scraping. He tried desperately to protect himself. And as soon as they had come, they left, each one carrying with them a feather in their beaks. Ahmed fell from the sky and was impaled on a spear of the Sultan's bodyguard. As he watched the life fade away from him, staring up at the infinite blue sky, he swore that in the distance he could hear an old gypsy woman laughing. When it was the 750th night, King Shahryar walked back and forth in his bedchamber. In truth, he'd become rather fond of his wife. And in fact, she'd already given him one baby boy and was pregnant with another.
But a vow is a vow. Mother of my children or my wife, what is the difference? Shehrazad, enough is enough. Tomorrow you must die. And this time I mean it.
Oh, King, she laughed. You know, I've never known anyone quite as quick with the axe as you. All except for one man.
And who was he?
And so she began the story of Emperor Akbar and Bilal. Emperor Akbar was a Muslim ruler of India who was one of the very first to unite the entire country after the Muslims had invaded several hundred years earlier. But although he was a Muslim, the reason that he kept peace in the entire country was that his chief advisor was a Hindu called Bilal, and so a certain balance of power between the religions was maintained. Everybody respected Bilal's intelligence. However, many envied him his position. After all, he was the voice of the king, his right-hand man, and some of them plotted his downfall. Not least among Bilal's enemies was a barber. The barber came in one morning to shave Emperor Akbar's chin. "Oh, my emperor, today I am having a vision to shave every hair on your head, also the eyebrows." "Yes, I think just a quick trim will do." "As you're wishing, sir, you are afterward emperor, and a worthy one too. As I was saying to your father last night in my dreams, he would be so proud." Wait. You saw my father, my dear departed father, in your dreams? Emperor Akbar, of course, was fascinated by dreams, as the barber knew too well. "Oh yes, I was there with him in heaven, and they were having such a wonderful time there." "How is he? He has everything he needs?" "Well, they are there and they are drinking such fine drinks and eating such wonderful sherbets and such comfortable cushions. Only they are missing someone wise to talk to give them advice and so." Emperor Akbar thought to himself, "Well, who do I know who is wise? Bilal! Send for Bilal! And send for the executioner!" Bilal turned up an hour or two later. He walked into the palace, he saw the executioner, and he saw the barber. And he guessed at once something was going on. "Now, Bilal, thank you for coming so quickly. Now, please, I have a great honor for you today. You are to die and go to serve my Father in heaven. Now, how would you like to be killed? The axe is customary, but I know you Hindus, you are having your ways." Bilal thought quickly on his feet. "Your Majesty, it is true I am Hindu, and therefore I am also a loyal subject of your Majesty. So I have just two requests for you. First, I would wish for 2 weeks to settle all the matters of state and affairs of politics, to leave your kingdom in the best possible state. And number 2, I would like to be, according to my tradition, buried alive in my house." "Well, of course, whatever you need, of course." Bilal returned home, and he brought some carpenters to his house and asked them to expand the basement, which he got to from a trapdoor hidden in the floor. He then asked them to make an exit towards the back that led to a side street. He then filled up the basement with all manners of sweetmeats and candles and dry bread and books, enough to keep him safe for a long time. The day arrived, and Emperor Akbar was delighted to see that his chief counselor hadn't run away, as many said he would, but was there in his house, waiting to be buried alive. The builders came in and began to place bricks in ever-increasing layers, until finally Bilal disappeared from view, giving a final bow. Well, some 6 months passed, and the barber took advantage of the vacuum of power to take Bilal's place in the palace as the emperor's chief advisor as well as barber. And Emperor Akbar was beginning to wonder if he had not acted a little bit too quickly. Son, this morning, after shaving your majestic chin, I have a vision for you. I am seeing rivers of milk through the city, so everyone may know how rich and creamy is your rule. Yes, I think just a trim will do. But at that moment, somebody walked into the palace with his hair and beard trailing down to his waist. The emperor was astonished that his guards had allowed to enter some bum from the street. But then he caught the look of the eyes of the stranger. No. Bilal? Can it be? Your Majesty, I have just this moment returned from heaven, where I have spent much wonderful hours sitting with your father, talking of politics and philosophy. Yes, yes, and is he well there? Oh, he is wonderful in heaven. It is such a wonderful place. Only one thing they are missing. As you can see, they have no barber in heaven. Send for the executioner! And so, when it was the 1000th night, King Shahryar walked backwards and forwards in his room.
Oh, Shahrazad, my heart has grown so fond in these years. You have borne me 2 bright baby boys. You are charming, beautiful. Beauty. It is your beauty that you control, men. It is beauty is our downfall. Beauty is a trap, I tell you.
But King, surely beauty is a trap that works both ways.
What can you mean?
Have you not heard the story of Princess Faya, the most beautiful girl in the world? And so she told a story of a baby girl who was born, who was so beautiful that one of the nurses couldn't help but pick her up and run out of the hospital with her. The nurse moved away to another town, changed their names, and aware that others would likely fall under the same spell as she had, she covered the baby girl's face with a veil. But of course she couldn't hide the eyes, and the eyes were often enough. And so it was, the nurse was out one day in the street making some shopping with the baby girl whom she named Faya, when the king's carriage rode by, and the driver caught one glimpse of baby Faya's eyes and lost control of the horses, crashing the carriage into a fish stand, sending the fish high up in the air. And as the king stuck his head out of the window to find out what was going on, a large haddock slapped him on the cheek. That would normally have been cause for him to order the execution of everybody present. But in that moment, he caught a glimpse of baby Faya's eyes, and stepping out of the carriage, he walked forwards as if in a dream, pulled down the veil of the baby girl, and saw a beauty he thought reserved only for the angels. Picking the girl up in his arms, he carried her back towards the carriage, of course being a king, accustomed to having anything that he wanted. The nurse, seeing her daughter leave her, gave a loud cry, whereas the king simply snapped his fingers absent-mindedly, and his servants ran forwards to cover the woman from head to foot in gold coins. But from the way she shook with grief beneath the treasure, it was clear it was no compensation. However, that was how baby Faya became Princess Faya, and was destined to grow up in the palace. the king would spend the better part of his days playing with her. He forgot about all of his responsibilities of state and running the kingdom, just to spend hours playing hide and seek and chasing her in the garden. And to hear her laugh was like to drink spring water from the deepest mountain. And so as the years passed, baby Freya grew up into a lovely young girl and then a dazzling young woman. Her face was like the moon shining at its brightest. Her lips were like a piece of coral. Her skin made silk seem rough. Her eyes were like two dark pools reflecting the stars. And her hair trailed down upon her shoulders like strands of gold. There wasn't a man or a woman in the kingdom who was not deeply in love with her. In fact, it was enough to see the sight of her shadow to send people shivering uncontrollably with desire. There were people working in the countryside, in the fields, who had never seen her, who loved her desperately by the mere description of Princess Freya. And although the women pretended to be jealous and said they would like to see her fall from grace, they too lost their hearts when they only set eyes upon her. In fact, it happened that a neighbouring king was shown a drawing of Princess Freya sketched in the sand, and he at once dispatched his army to bring her back. The invading army was met with fierce resistance on the battlefield, the soldiers who ran out to protect her. And there would have been terrible bloodshed had not Princess Freya rode out in that very moment on a wonderful white horse and all forgot everything they were supposed to be doing, just gazed at her. With one delicate waving motion, she sent all of the soldiers home, each with a stupid smile upon their faces. And so it was that Princess Freya grew up believing that she was the centre of the world. She had only to look at a thing to have it. But she liked to spend the better part of her time in the gardens, where the birds and the butterflies flocked around her, competing to land upon her shoulders. There were nightingale birds who sang for her all through the night, their highest honour. But although her beauty was so great that even the sun, after setting, would sometimes rise again for a couple of moments just to take one last lingering look, and the moon itself would hesitate overhead until the stars hurried her along, still the question remained: who could Princess Freya possibly marry? The king reluctantly had to admit he was too old for the job. But he was determined that she should have nothing but the best. A call was sent out through the land for all of those of noble blood to come and try for Princess Freya's hand. There arrived mighty warriors from the mountains, their arms and legs like trunks of trees, battling it out with quarterstaves and swords. There arrived fine princes dressed in silk suits, who began to compete in trials of eloquence and wit. They all camped out there outside the palace, but Princess Freya simply looked on from her tower, shook her head in scorn. Let the man who can look at me without trembling, without shaking, be my husband, she said. And so she was taken out of the palace, carried on a chair by her servants. And each of the contenders jostled for their place in the queue. And each one of them stepped forwards, but prince or warrior, none could meet her gaze and entertain the idea of spending their lives with such a vision of beauty without wobbling away in failure. In fact, all tried and failed, and Princess Freya, quite bored of the whole thing, was ready to return to her gardens when one last voice spoke up.
But I haven't had my turn yet.
Everyone was astonished to turn and see a small man dressed in dirty, ash-covered clothes, his skin gleaming white beneath the smudges of dirt. Only those of noble birth may try for the princess's hand, the king explained. I am lord of the underground mountains of the north. My kingdom is both greater and more numerous than this one. I shall have my turn. Let him try, Mrs. Freya said. And so it was. The contender was brought forwards. He stared in the direction of where he had heard her speak, and met her gaze without twitching a muscle. And perceiving the approach of dawn, Shahrazad grew quiet. And when it was the 1001st night, she continued, that as the princess looked upon the challenger, she suddenly understood. The man was blind. She stepped down from her chair, and taking the arm of her new husband, they began to walk away towards the mountains of the north, a place people had previously thought that no one even lived. Crowds of men and women, dogs and cats came running after her, not to mention the birds and the butterflies, but holding up one hand, they understood that she meant to keep her word. And all stood there, tears streaming down their cheeks as they watched Princess Freya depart into the horizon. The entire city fell into mourning after that. Everyone dressed in black. Music was prohibited. And the sound of laughter was a stranger to the streets for many years to come. Only when some 20 or 30 years had passed, a new generation grew up who had never even seen Princess Freya and were really, quite frankly, bored by all the stories of her. No one could be that beautiful, they said. And so once again, life returned to the city. And perhaps the memory of her would have faded altogether, had it not been for some 40 years after she disappeared. On a cold, rainy, stormy night, an old woman with a cloak over her head approached the gates of the palace. If she wanted to beg, she could come back in the morning, the guards told her. People were more softly spoken when I lived here, she said, pulling back her cloak. The younger guard just laughed, but the older one, though he'd been but a boy when Freya had left, he recognized her at once.
Milady?
And clipping the younger guard around the ear, he sent him off to get the king at once. And hurrying down, he opened up the gates and helped Princess Freya into the palace gardens. Her face was deathly white and pale, and no longer quite had the beauty of her youth. Lines etched into her skin, liver spots around the mouth, and she walked with a stoop, and every few paces needed to stop to catch her breath. Finally they reached a bench, and she declared she could go no further, and took her seat. The king was brought down to meet her, and his eyesight was so far gone, he only recognized her when he came within a few paces. Freya? Is it you? I held on to life all these years, praying you would come back. I would have sent armies to bring you back, but I... And he collapsed on his knees, his head in her lap, as she stroked the old man's hair. My husband died last month, she said. The people of his underground kingdom have short lives, breathing in the dust of the mountain. But as dark and gloomy as his kingdom was, I would never have wanted to come back. He was the first person to ever see me. I've been invisible my whole life without realizing it. Only now, my lungs are full of dust. and I've returned to die in the gardens that I loved so much. As if on cue, 3 songbirds swooped down to a branch, and seeing the king there with his head buried in the lap of his daughter, both of them close to death, they broke into a chorus of grief and longing. And that is how they were found in the morning. The father and his daughter dead. The songbird singing melancholy songs above them.
What a sad story. Life is but one violent storm, and man, he is a handful of dust. Sherizachi, can you ever forgive me? I have been a fool, a fool. There is no greater fool than a king. Let us be married, this time for real. My younger brother will marry your younger sister, and we will make amends for everything.
And so the word went through the land that King Shahryar's madness had now passed, and a fantastic wedding was planned for both of them. There were musicians called, there were chickens fed on pistachios, whole roasted goats with their mouths stuffed with dates, silks and carpets, gold coins thrown to the poor, and each of the brides was brought forth in a series of 7 dresses, and all agreed that the 2 sisters were as beautiful as the moon, shining at its fullest. And when some weeks of the honeymoon had passed, King Shahryar's brother departed for the south to take up his kingdom again. And both couples lived long and happy lives, ruling well and compassionately, until the destroyer of delights, the separator of societies, the enemy of friends, God himself, took them from this life and under his breast. And that is the story, or a part of it, of 1001 Nights.